Welcome back, everyone. Spring and summer is a time for new growth and taking bold action together. So we hope these stories can inspire you to live boldly, take wise chances, and with our friends and family, make a difference together. Today we will be reading The Adventures of Wishbone, Digging to the Center of the Earth by Michael Anthony Steele, inspired by A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. So lean in with a spirit of adventure, grab a friend, and let's enjoy the story together. Chapter 12. Boom! The roar of the blast was incredible. The deafening sound echoed through the cavern and out into the sea. Pieces of stone shot out of the block and tunnel and over the sea as if a giant cannon was firing at threatening ships. Luckily, the raft was a safe distance away from the blast. Most of the larger bits of stone landed in the sea in front of it. Yet tiny pieces still showered above the raft as the water it floated upon rippled from the vibration sent throughout the giant cavern. Good thing we weren't in a, inflatable raft of some kind. Once the explosion had ended, Professor Lidenbrock removed his paws from his ears. It's probably not the most efficient way of protecting your hearing with paws, but that's good. Then as the echo from the blast faded, the professor, Axel, and Hans steered back to the part of the shore that was now marked by a smoky cloud of dust. Hans, Professor said suddenly, let us return to land and see if our work has been a success. Hans quickly paddled the raft towards the sandy beach. The Icelander rowed a few strokes, then he stopped and tilted his head to one side as if listening for something. Seeing this, Professor did the same, but all he heard was the fading echo of the explosion. Wait a minute. Is the echo really fading? Professor thought. As he listened, it seemed to remain strangely at the same level, which was completely wrong. From what they had experienced in the vastness of the sea and the cavern in which it lay, the rumbling echo should have faded, but it hasn't. In fact, it now seemed a bit louder. A small splash near the raft pulled the professor from his thoughts. He looked around to see pieces of stone fall from the clouds. You want the blanket? That doesn't seem very comfortable. My little wishbone. There you go. Let's see. Large sprays of sand flew into the air when the stones hit the ground. Is that where it was? I'll go back to the paragraph. A small splash near the raft pulled the professor from his thoughts. He looked around to see pieces of stone fall from the clouds above and the land and the sea around them. Professor then looked toward the shore. There he saw stones break loose. Oh, you don't like my makeshift bellow? Okay. Large sprays of sand flew into the air when the stones hit the ground. It would seem that we have triggered off something other than the boulder with our explosion, the professor yelled over the even louder rumble. It seems we have interrupted something that would have probably been best left undisturbed. Constant thunder became louder than... They probably blew the eardrums out of all of those mastodons, but it's fine. The waves splashed over the sides of the raft as it was tossed by a sudden vibrating storm. An ear-splitting crack drew the professor's attention upward. It sounded as if the entire ceiling of the giant cavern was about to come crashing down upon them, but all that Lidenbrock could see was the electricity dancing through a cloudy haze. Without warning, a giant stone 10 times the size of the raft fell from the clouds. Blue lightning danced across the huge rock's surface as it rippled through the cloudy haze. The threatening object was enormous, and it was plunging directly in the path of the flimsy raft. Hans! The professor yelled. Icelander looked up. Without a moment of delay, he frantically began to paddle the endangered raft. Axel, upon following the professor's gaze, shoved his arm into the water and began to paddle as well. Axel and Hans's desperate paddling saved the raft and its passengers from a deadly fate. When the giant stone slammed to the water's surface, it plunged only inches away from the raft's edge. Its first impact almost overturned the craft and its 3 crewmen. As the stone sank, the force from the suction almost pulled the raft down with it. When the sea had calmed from the giant rocks' splash, Professor Lidenbrock looked up to where it had fallen from. As he suspected, he saw the clouds being sucked into the huge hole in the cavern's ceiling where the stone had once sat. It seemed as if they had poked a hole in the sky. Suddenly, the raft heaved beneath them with a great force. Professor had to use his nails on all 4 paws just to cling to the raft's surface. Most of their supplies were hurled over the side as the raft shot upwards. Hans and Axel held on for dear life as well. Another sea monster? Axel cried with terror. No, the professor yelled above the now deafening roar. This monster is a geyser, a great giant surge of water pushing up from the sea floor. No doubt we set off a volcanic reaction with our explosion. He looked back at the enormous hole in the cavern's ceiling. It was getting closer as the geyser pushed them upward towards it. Volcanic? Axel cried, his arms wrapped tightly around the mast. The raft hurled towards the cavern ceiling and towards the huge hole that had been carved out of it. Electricity flickered all around them as they passed through the illuminating clouds. Professor looked up from into the hole. He realized that it was the beginning of a long tunnel leading upward as far as he could see. Then the three travelers were thrust into darkness as a field of electricity was left behind them. Through the roar of the rushing water below them, Professor Linnenbrock heard the striking of a match and the spark of fire as Hans tried to light a lantern. Oh, that's a good idea. Their Ruhmkorff coils had gone over the side of the raft with the rest of their gear. Luckily, though, Hans had been able to save one of their regular lanterns. Once the lantern was lit, the shaft they were hurling through was illuminated with a dim, warm glow. The shaft was about 3 times as wide as the raft. The raft itself bobbed on a cushion of churning water. All around them, solid rock whizzed past them at incredible speeds. Not only have we set off a volcanic reaction, the professor said, but we seem to be right inside a volcano. Inside a volcano? Axel asked in surprise. Uncle, are you sure? Most definitely, Professor Lindbrock said. Do you not already notice a rapid rise in temperature? I think I'm too frightened to tell, Axel replied. Professor walked over to an edge of the wobbling but more stable raft. Then look here, he said to his nephew. Do you not see the steam beginning to rise? Professor placed his paw next to the edge where a small billowing cloud of steam had begun to emerge. If my calculations are correct, a large body of lava is pushing the mass of water on which we ride to the surface. Most fortunate thing. Fortunate? Axel cried. He seemed not to believe what he was hearing. Yes, dear nephew, the professor replied calmly. It is the only chance we now have to escape from the interior of the earth and go back to the true light of day. He turned to Hans, then looked back to Axel. If we cannot continue on Saknussemm's trail, then this is our best hope. Very diplomatic. You speak of hope, Axel said, but how is there hope in being spit out of the earth with showers of cinders and boiling lava? While there is life, there is hope, Professor Lidenbrock replied. I wish to tell you something most important, Axel. As long as a man's heart beats, as long as a man can have feelings, as long as a dog's tail wags, and as long as people are blessed with thought and determination, there is no room for despair. Axel and Hans stared at the professor in silence. Professor Lindenbrock trotted over to where Axel was sitting. I do believe the situation is, to a certain extent, desperate. He placed a comforting paw on Axel's arm. There remains, however, a good chance of survival, Professor continued. We must prepare ourselves for whatever may turn up in the great chapter of accidents. But will the lava not eventually make its way to the raft itself? Axel asked. He was still clinging to the mast. It could very well happen, indeed, Professor Lidenbrock replied. However, the logs, which were so carefully chosen by Hans, should protect us from the lava for a short time. I just hope it will be long enough, the professor thought to himself. The raft continued to hurl upwards towards the throat of the volcano. Professor's nose dripped with sweat as the temperature continued to rise as fast as the raft did. It seemed as if the heat was not coming from just below them, but from all around, as if the entire earth were made of fire. The rapid climb made it difficult to breathe, and Professor Lidenbrock panted to catch his breath. He looked around and saw that both Axel and Hans were dripping with sweat as well. As Professor watched his fellow travelers, however, he noticed he could see them more clearly. A quick look upwards confirmed what he believed. At the top of the long tunnel, there was a small dot of bright light, a dot that was growing in size by the second. Axel, Hans, Professor shouted, look! Do you see? We are nearing the top of the volcano! What had taken them almost a month to travel away from was now approaching quickly due to their incredible speed. The daylight that shone through the volcano's mouth was getting brighter and brighter. Professor head spun as he tried to calculate the speed at which they traveled. They had been almost 100 miles below the Earth's surface. Now the light from the volcano's mouth approached them like the light of a speeding locomotive. The raft tipped and turned as it gained even more speed. With the opening of the volcano getting closer, the bright light of day was almost blinding to someone who'd been underground for such a long period of time. Smoke was beginning to rise as the liquid, fiery lava made its way to the underside of the raft. Hold on, my friends, the professor yelled. He moved closer to the center of the raft where Axel and Hans were clinging desperately. He gave a reassuring lick to Axel's hand just before they were swallowed up inside a blinding light. Professor Lidenbrock slowly awoke to find himself in Hans's arms. He was being placed next to a semi-conscious Axel. The air was full of smoke and the scent of what smelled like burning coal. Trying to identify his surroundings, Professor looked around groggily. Through squinting eyes, he saw that they were sitting on a slope of a mountain not 2 yards from a huge cliff. They would have fallen from it if they had made the slightest false step. Where are we? Moaned the professor. Hans just shrugged his shoulders. When his eyes had fully adjusted to the warm sunlight, the professor gazed at the mysterious landscape. Above them he saw the opened crater from which they had escaped. They continued to spit fire and cinders into the air. From where they were perched, however, they were safe from its eruptions, at least for now. Professor's eyes followed the slope of the giant volcano downward to see it disappear into a lush green forest. Professor then saw the waters of what was either a lovely sea or a beautiful lake. He gazed even farther. He saw a little port crowded with houses. Nearby, boats and vessels of a strange shape were floating upon turquoise waves. "Where can we be?" Axel asked, looking at the same setting. Professor stood on 4 wobbly legs. "Whatever this mountain may be," he said, "I do not think it is worthwhile to have left the interior of a volcano and remain here to receive huge pieces of rock on our heads." He turned to face the base of the volcano. "Let us carefully go down the mountain to discover where we are. And maybe we'll have a nice snack," he thought. Being blasted in a volcano can really work up your appetite. The 3 explorers slowly made their way down the steep, slippery slope. They slid over piles of ash, trying desperately to avoid the streams of hot lava that flowed like fiery serpents. When they reached the bottom of the volcano, Professor Lindenbrock led the way to a spring of fresh water that fed a small brook. Professor bent his head forward and lapped up the cool water. On each side of him he heard Axel and Hans do the same. "What a sight we must be," he thought. 3 tired travelers, most of our clothes either ripped or burned, all of us lined up in a row on our bellies drinking from a stream. Professor Lindenbrock let out a small chuckle in between swallows. Professor raised his head in front of him. Between 2 olive trees, a small child stood, watching their very strange sight that he had just had in his thoughts. "Ah," he said, "here's someone who lives in this country." The little boy was poorly dressed. As soon as he realized he had been seen, he began to run away. Hans quickly jumped over the stream and took hold of the boy despite his kicks and cries. Professor and Axel joined the 2. "What is the name of this mountain?" Professor asked the frightened youth. The child made no reply. Professor Lindenbrock went on to ask him the same question in English and French. Still the boy said nothing. When the professor asked the same question in Italian, the boy yelled, "Stromboli!" Then he dashed away from Hans's grip and disappeared in the olive groves. "Stromboli!" the professor repeated with amazement. "What a journey! What a marvelous journey!" Professor Lindenbrock leapt in the air with glee and laughed. Is it what I think it is, Uncle?" Axel asked, as if he didn't want to get his hopes up. "Yes, dear nephew," the professor replied. "We entered the earth by way of one volcano in the great icy regions of Iceland. We have come out of another one under blue sky of the island of Sicily, just off the coast of Italy. We are more than 2,000 miles away from where we started." When Hans heard the name Stromboli, he too laughed with amazement. It was the most emotion he shown throughout the entire journey. Axel and the professor looked at each other and smiled. Professor Lindenbrock supposed that Hans could not believe how far their adventure had taken them. What an incredible journey! The 3 explorers enjoyed a delicious meal of olives, fruits, and fresh water. Here's another picture. Then they began the end of their incredible journey as they made their way to the port of Stromboli. In order not to be mistaken by the locals as spirits that had been shot out of the volcano, Professor Lindenbrock decided they would pretend to be unfortunate shipwrecked travelers. As they walked through the forest in the direction of the port, Axel let Hans take the lead. He fell back to walk with his uncle. "Thank you, Uncle," he said softly. "Thank you?" the professor asked, his tail wagging slightly. "Why, whatever for, dear boy?" "Thank you for showing me the incredible wonders we have seen," Axel replied. "Thank you for showing me my strength, my courage. But most of all, thank you for taking me with you on this fantastic journey." Professor Lindenbrock's tail wagged harder now. Axel continued, "I'm proud to be the nephew of the great Professor Lindenbrock, member of all the scientific, geographical, mineralogical, and geological societies." Professor stopped walking. So did Axel. Professor placed his 2 front paws on Axel's leg. "My dear nephew," Professor Lindenbrock began, "you honor me with your kind words. We have been on a most incredible journey. We have made many important discoveries. We have also seen things perhaps no one will ever believe. We've been on the edge of death and back, as well as having traveled to the depths of the earth." He looked to the now distant volcano, then back at Axel. "But of one thing I am certain with all my heart. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Axel." Axel rubbed a hand across his uncle's head. "Thank you, Uncle." "No, Axel," the professor said. "I thank you." The professor got back down on the ground and continued through the forest towards Hans. With his tail still wagging, he began to run. He looked back to see that Axel was doing the same. "Come, dear boy," he yelled back at his adventurous nephew. "The whole world waits to hear of our discoveries. Everyone wishes to see the 3 explorers who have been on a most incredible journey towards the center of the earth." What a great adventure! A trip to Iceland, climbing into a volcano, sailing across an underground sea, and being spat out of an active volcano. I'll say one thing about Professor Linnebrock. He really knows how to cure a case of boredom. Now it's time to see where our adventure in Oakdale is going to end up. And that does it for chapter 12. We'll see you soon for chapter 13, the last chapter.